All right, everyone, welcome back. This is going to be part 4 of the history of the American labor movement, and we are going to be picking up more or less where we left off at the end of part 3. So, basically, at the end of part 3, we had just run upon the Revolutionary War, and we had had some pretty good progress as far as labor organizing goes, before the war with the benevolent societies and, the small trade unions basically forming their own militias. And then the war happened, and we had the reality and the horrors of war really set in the colonies. There was a massive loss of life, there was, horrific injuries, their society was basically decimated, more or less, right? We're really starting from scratch after the war. And so, after the war, we have a lot of the people who had been part of the small labor unions, organizations, they were still around, and so they, tried to reform these societies, these organizations. However, a lot of the people who had previously been leading these organizations, leaders of the Sons of Liberty, they now found themselves in positions of power. And they found themselves with some wealth. Maybe they, had a little bit of profit during the war, or they laid claim to some of the British wealth as the British fled the continent. Things like that, right? Until as old as time, as soon as a group of people get control and power and wealth, they don't want to see it wrested from them by the masses. So all of a sudden we have a new ruling class, basically. Kind of a same boss, different job. No, same job, different boss. I don't know. Anyways, you know what I mean, right? So basically the government in the colonies was just replaced by Americans. And people didn't really love this, going forward. We're trying to set up a new form of government. And there's a little bit of a schism between the political people, right? On one side, we have the Federalists who kind of want to keep the wealthy in power, have them be the arbiters of how things move forward. And then we have, the Jeffersonian Democrats on the other side, and they want a more egalitarian society. They want the choice to be, choices to be made by the people, for the people, and that sort of thing. And so to keep power, to keep things more or less the way they were, the Federalists formed the first Red Scare in America. Now, this is something we'll see time and again going forward, not only in America, but across the world. But this is really the first instance of it, right? So during the American Revolution, across the sea, we have in France the French Revolution, and they were really effective at overthrowing their wealthy ruling class. And so the people in America did not want to see that happen in America. They wanted to keep things the way, they wanted to keep their money, basically. All right. So we have these people come out and say to the public and through the papers and put out leaflets and things like that, saying that these societies that are popping up, these organizations, these labor groups, they are part of a vast, secret, subversive international body known as the Bavarian Illuminati. And they've been organized by the French Jacobins. Now, the idea of an Illuminati in 1795 is 10 times more absurd than the idea of an Illuminati in 2020, but it's still equally preposterous, right? Imagine people sending, notes across the ocean in ships trying to organize from France to America. Nothing's impossible, but it's pretty much impossible. And they said that if these Jacobins succeed in infiltrating the American government and the colonies, that the Bible will be cast into a bonfire, and our wives and daughters will be the victims of prostitution. They will be dishonored, polluted, and become the outcasts of delicacy and virtue. Our wives and daughters will become the loathing of God and man. So they made a massive appeal to the moral and religious, basically, ideals of the people who were in the colonies, and they used that to turn these people who were trying to organize labor into villains. And it's written in the Jeffersonian Papers that every attempt at this point to restore the liberties of mankind or to check the progress of arbitrary power is now styled Jacobism, and it's been demonized. So that's where we're at as far as organizing and labor and, a working class movement in the colonies, in what we now call America, all right? So post-Revolutionary War, on the economic side of things, we have kind of a big vacuum that has been left by the trade with England and, the exchange of raw materials for manufactured goods, because for obvious reasons, England doesn't really want to do business with America anymore, at least not for now. And so we have a need for raw materials, and we have some opportunists pop in, okay? And they call themselves, or we call them retroactively, the merchant capitalists. And these are people who, they had enough wealth, either they had family wealth, or they had profited during the war, or gotten their wealth through some other means, probably not, the most virtuous means. And they were able to basically purchase up large swaths of raw materials. So huge forests full of lumber, mining rights, mineral rights, water rights, all these things like that. Land for farming, for cotton, for textiles, and things like that. And so now all of a sudden, before like all of the working people in the colonies can even blink, these industries have been monopolized. Just lickety split, right? Basically, all the people who had money bought all the stuff there was to buy, and so this creates a strange power dynamic, right? And during this time, we have a tiny little bright spot as far as labor organizing goes, and it's like the one good thing that comes out of this whole like 50-60 year time span, and that is that in 1830 we had our first general strike in America, and that was in Philadelphia. And basically all of the workers were tired from post-war society, and they were working way too long for way too low wages. And so all of the workers in the city somehow pulled off a strike. We don't really know how. I'm sure that it's something worth looking into, how they pulled that off. But they won a 10-hour workday. And that is something that was written into law in most of the major cities and seaports at that time. So now you have a 10-hour workday. Still a long day, but it's not a 16-hour workday. You're not expected to work as long as your boss tells you to work or get fired. And that's a huge leap forward. Unfortunately, it's not really enforced. We don't really have national laws at this point. So it's kind of like just little tiny pockets where we have a little tiny bit of labor regulation, but it's better than nothing. All right. So now we're going to move forward to 1850. And at this point, all of the people who had been previously working in small shops or, making their own living, making their own goods, selling their own things before the war, now 71% of them are working in factories. And these factories are owned by who? Our merchant capitalists who had, over the last few decades, purchased and monopolized all of the raw materials in America, essentially, right? And so it says in the history books that there were 4 things that we needed to have, the American factory system come about the way it did. And the first thing was capital. So the people who had the capital were our merchant capitalists, and they certainly took advantage of it. All right, and then we needed a concentration of labor. So in our major cities, we have a bunch of people who needed work. And so they were willing to work for what they could get, basically. And then we needed the use of mechanical power to replace muscle. So, now that you have mechanical power and things that, mechanical, you no longer need the strongest laborers. You no longer need the most well-fed laborers. You no longer need, you no longer have to be discretionary about who you hire, I guess, right? And then the 4th ingredient, and this is probably the most destructive of all of the things that has ever happened in as far as labor goes for America, is the introduction of machinery that replaces skilled workers. So all of a sudden, all of these master tradesmen and craftsmen who had their journeymen working below them and their apprentices working below them, and they had leverage and they had pull and they had say-so in their local governments because they had, they had some leverage, like I said before. And all of a sudden, they are easily replaced by like a 7, 8, 9-year-old within 2 days who can be trained on the machinery and paid a quarter of the wages of the master tradesman or the journeyman. And so nobody has leverage anymore. And this is what we call the great devaluation of American labor. So at this point, all of our master skilled craftsmen who spent years and years honing their skills, they're pushed out, or they're made to accept extremely low wages. And from this point forward, like basically this is the turning point for all of America in the working class, because from this point forward, the majority of the people are employees. No longer are we self-employed, no longer are we self-determining, right? We are working a job for a wage, and we don't determine our wage. We're replaceable, just a part in the machine, right? Just a cog in the wheel. And so Uh, this spreads to every industry. We have spinning mills, the textile industry is basically completely overhauled. Um, on the iron industry, foundries, when steel is introduced, the steel industry, and the food industry, mills and grinding of grains and all of that is all fully mechanized. And we have the steam engine turning into the steam turbine and coal gas engines, so we don't really need manpower anymore. So more and more people are accepting more and more work for smaller and smaller wages. And you can see where we're headed here, right? To dark times. So soon the Civil War kicks off, and this is great for the economy, right? Always during wartime, we have a big boom in production, and especially with the new factories, things really ramp up. And, it's like a gigantic leap forward from making things for people just in town to providing for a war, right? We need large-scale manufacturing of weapons, machinery parts. We need to construct the railways and the telegraph lines, and everybody's working and everybody's hustling, and it's great until, it's not great because it's a civil war and people are dying and it's horrible, but you know what I mean, right? Economically, things are going all right until the war is over, and we have all of these things being, produced, and we have such a gigantic, scaled up economy, basically, and there's no longer a need for any of these things. Now, the way it's written in most history books is that there were so many things being produced and not that many things being bought, right? And that is what caused our first Great Depression in America, which went from 1873 to 1879. And basically, because nobody's buying things, people are either working for the tiniest of wages or they're not working at all. And what they don't tell you is that the reason nothing is being bought is because the people who are producing the things are not being paid enough to buy the things. So these things are being produced for no one. They're not being purchased. The people aren't. It's basically like a horrible, I don't know, like Ferris wheel, right? You can't buy things because you're not making enough money, but you're making the things, and now there's too many things. And so it's not really the fault of the working people. It is the fault of the people who are employing the working people and not paying them a high enough wage. So we have our Great Depression, we have low wages, we have a monopoly of power and wealth for a small amount of people, and this is leading to where it gets exciting, okay? Going forward, we are going to really kick off the true meat of the American labor movement, and I'll just leave you with one quote from President Lincoln at the end of the war, and he said, "No good thing has been or can be enjoyed by us without having first cost labor. And inasmuch as most good things are produced by labor, it follows that all such things of right belong to those whose labor has produced them. But it has so happened in all ages of the world that some have labored, and others have without labor enjoyed a large proportion of the fruits. This is wrong and should not continue. To secure to each laborer the whole product of his labor, or as nearly as possible, is a worthy object of any good government." Those are the words of the current sitting president, and that kind of paints a picture of what's to come. Okay, so I'll see you next time, and this is where it gets exciting. Okay.